Back. So many had to go, and I've been called to replace him. I'm gonna announce the speakers for the next session in a minute. I wanted to say something first. What you guys have just seen now was really, really amazing. It's really outstanding what we just saw, and I wanna break it down for you from my perspective. We just saw 3 startups. 3 relatively young, and I'm not talking about their age, I'm talking about experience, 3 relatively young CEOs sitting with 4 CISOs from the biggest companies in the world in front of an audience, being grilled, being asked questions about their business model, asked questions about their technology, about competitors, about their go-to-market, even about exit. We're already talking about them being sold, right? And you know what, from this stage, I want to give the challenge to any security company, big security company, to sit here, to have their CEO sit here with CEOs and answer the same questions, right? So big round of applause for the startups who did it. It takes a lot of courage. Really amazing work you guys have done. We need to remember that this industry has a few different driving forces, and VC is one of them, of course, while being a leader in this space. And the startups are another driving force in that, and we need to nurture that, just like the gentleman said about TLC, right? Giving tender love and care. So we need to love our startups and help them succeed because they're driving us forward. So without further ado, I would like to open the final session of today's events and call on stage. Well, before I call on stage, we're going to talk about balancing security and privacy. And I want you to pause for a minute and think about this. We're putting a scale and we're putting security on one end and privacy on the other, meaning there's some kind of a trade-off between security and privacy. And in itself, that's a fascinating concept to think, why would privacy come at the expense of security and vice versa? So to hopefully answer this question, if not at least a dozen others, I would like to invite now onto the stage Mr. Michael Daniel, the President and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance, CTA. Please help me welcoming him on stage. Sir?
Thank you. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for having me here in Cyber Week. It's very exciting to be here. I always love the opportunity to come to Israel. So I'm gonna, we've heard that the theme for this week is balancing the equation. And we were just talking about the balance between privacy and cybersecurity. But I'm actually and we're often told that that equation is one that we actually have to solve. We have to solve for the tension between cybersecurity and privacy. But I'm actually going to talk to you a little bit today about how I actually think that's wrong. And it's wrong in at least 2 ways. One is, it's actually not just privacy and security. It's actually 3 things. It's privacy, security, and safety. So it's actually not a duality, it's a triad, it's a triangle. And second, they're not inherently at odds with each other. In fact, they are critically interrelated. They are critically interdependent. And I would argue that if you don't have good safety, security, and privacy, you actually don't have any of those 3. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So, usually this is portrayed this way. Cybersecurity and privacy are often perceived as and presented as opposites. And some of this is, thrown out as a zero-sum game. You either increase your security by sharing data, or you increase your privacy by not sharing data. They're often talked about in terms of conflicting frameworks for how you even think about these issues. That privacy, again, is all about restricting the flow of data, and security is all about making data move, right? There's incompatible terminology. The privacy advocates talk about FIPS, Fair Information Privacy Practices, and GDPR and other things like that. And then the cyber nerds, we talk about, how many appliances are in your stack and network segmentation. And it's like they're talking completely different languages. But that's just not accurate. Security and privacy in the digital age are critically dependent on each other. If you start to think about it, in this digital world where information is digital, if you don't have privacy and you don't have security, you really don't have either. But in a digital world where we're actually hooking everything up to the internet, even that framework is incomplete because it's really not a duo, but it's a triad. And the third leg of that triad is safety. Now, this is an interesting issue because I know that in many languages, security and safety are actually the same word. But in English, they are slightly different, and that's why I sort of make the differentiation between them. But let's talk about what we actually mean by safety in this context. So safety is about protecting human life and health, and it's about safeguarding physical property. So why is safety a digital issue? Well, one is we have actually decided that we're going to completely merge the digital and physical realms through the Internet of Things, which we're pretty soon just going to call the Internet, right? Now everything is connected. And because of that connection, it means that these two realms that once were completely separate have now been brought together. So they're interrelated in that way. We're also very dependent on these digital devices. We rely on them. Things that our society operates on them. Emergency services operate on them. Factories operate on them. Everything you can imagine operates on them. And so we depend on these devices for almost every aspect of our lives, and when they go away, we've got a real problem. We also have an incomplete understanding of what this convergence means. Nobody really fully actually has figured all of that out. And so as a result of this, safety is now very much, public health and safety is now very much a digital issue. And it is one that we have to take into account when we're talking about this equation. So normally, the picture is drawn something like this: security on one side, privacy on the other. But I would argue that it actually needs to look like that: security, privacy, and safety in a triangle, all mutually dependent, all mutually interdependent. Now, they can reinforce each other. These concepts can reinforce each other. So it's pretty obvious how in a digital age, if you don't have good cybersecurity, you're clearly not going to have good privacy, right? Because the bad guys are going to be able to break in and steal stuff, steal information. You're also not going to be able to have safety because the adversary will be able to disrupt physical processes and potentially cause harm. But it is also true that good privacy practices reinforce cybersecurity. If the information's not there because you've chosen to implement good privacy policies and not collect the data, I don't have to protect it. Good privacy policies can reinforce safety because if you're protecting that personal information and ensuring that its dissemination is restricted, that reduces the ability of the bad guy to leverage it to do bad things. Safety practices can reinforce cybersecurity by segregating and reducing the attack surface that the bad guys have. Safety can also reinforce privacy by essentially preventing certain actions from even occurring because the bad guys don't get access to that information. So they can mutually reinforce each other. Now, it is also true, though, that if you do it stupidly, you can undermine each other. If you do cybersecurity in the wrong way, you can end up exposing personal data in a way that you shouldn't. If you end up doing safety in the wrong way, you can impose useless checklists on what's happening on the cybersecurity side. If you do privacy in the wrong way, you can essentially blank out entire resources, like essentially making whois go dark, so that security researchers no longer have access to a good tool that was helpful in pursuing the bad guys. So it is unquestionably true that these implemented poorly, they can undermine each other. But done right, they can actually reinforce each other. And that's why I argue that we should see this as a triangle, where the result is that all three of these concepts depend critically on the other. So now what are the implications for this triangle? So in my mind, there are really three implications that come out of having a triangle like this. One is that you have to design your policies in each of these areas with that dependency in mind. And if you try to optimize for only one corner of the triangle, you're going to fail. In essence, you could also think of it as a three-legged stool. And if you make one leg of the stool really high or one leg of the stool really low, it's going to fall over. So you actually have to be thinking about how the interactions between the policies. And policymakers should be encouraged to think about how these concepts actually interact. And when you're making policy in one area, understanding that it will have implications in another area. Second, you're going to have to manage the risk across all three areas simultaneously. And that in fact, your digital risk is a function of all three of these areas, not just one. Your digital risk is not just about your security. It's not just about your privacy. It's not just about your safety. It's about all three. So you're going to have to manage that risk in all areas simultaneously. You can't escape that. And then finally, the third implication is that we are actually going to need cross-discipline approaches to reduce that risk. If you're having to manage it simultaneously, then you need to consider that the tools that you're using may come from another discipline. So that in fact, given a certain security problem, your most effective solution might be a privacy tool. So if you're having problems, for example, protecting large amounts of data, one question is, are your privacy policies right? Why are you keeping that data? Do you really need it? Can it be stored in a different way? Can it be eliminated? That would be using a privacy policy to go after what is typically perceived as a cybersecurity problem. And so the best security tool might be a privacy or safety enhancement, and vice versa. So ultimately, what I would just say to bring my part of the session to a close is that we have to begin to shift our mindset. That we've typically thought of security and privacy as something that is inherently at odds with each other. One that you're just kind of balancing and you're trying to, make it work. But my contention to you is that in fact they are critically interdependent and interrelated, and that you cannot in fact have one without the other, and that in fact you need to be thinking about all three areas: security, privacy, and safety. And as we make the world more and more digital, as we continue down this path of digitization of our societies, that trade-off is, and that balancing act across all three of those concepts is going to become ever more critically dependent. So thank you very much. Thank you for letting me come and talk with you today. I really appreciate it.